I'm Marty Hobolevsky from the Blue Water Sierra Club, and I'm here to welcome you on behalf of the Sierra Club and also the SC4 Green Team. And this is a wonderful joint meeting tonight on a very important subject. There's a lot of people to thank. We're very grateful for the college, for St. Clair County Community College, giving us all the help, of course, hosting this meeting tonight. Special thanks are due to Bob Hunkler and Jackie Jablonski of the College Green Team, and also to Sean Starkey, who's the college's Executive Director of Public Relations, Marketing and Legislative Affairs, who did yeoman work in the last 10 days or so to help us market and promote this meeting on very short notice. We're grateful for everybody at the college. And I guess Ken Kepler is here on the faculty. Could you just talk about the Green Team for 1 minute? Tell us what we should know. Thanks, Ken.
Ken Kepler. I'm a member of the Green Team. A couple dozen of us voluntarily get together probably once a month on the average, full-time, part-time faculty as well as the odd student. And we have implemented a number of developments on campus, which include a rather extensive recycling program, some green spaces, the green roofs of some of the buildings. We have worked together with the bioswales in the parking lot, which is a way to capture a lot of rainwater that was going into storm sewers untreated before. A number of ongoing concerns, including energy consumption, as well as ways we can substitute better, more efficient ways of doing things on a campus this large. And we are one of the leading community colleges in this respect, trying to be proactive and trying to get more involvement by both the public and the faculty, and students to a degree, but students come and go quickly in a two-year college, so we try to maintain some continuity from year to year. And it's not a big effort, but we have made a fairly big splash for a number of us who are doing it, mainly because no one was doing it before, and we have gotten some good support from the administration, as well as some federal funding in places too. That's been very good. In my case, I am probably one of only a couple members who are both Sierra Club and Green Team, so I get caught both ends of the stick, as it were. But anyway, if you have more questions specifically, you can ask me afterwards, but I didn't come prepared with a handout kit or anything. We just kind of do things on a low-key basis, don't think a great deal about it. We've been trying to implement things such as bus passes, cycling racks, and so on in this current school year. And we're continuing to work on some longer term, especially recycling components as well. Thank you.
Perfect, Ken. Thank you. Thank you very much. Some people had asked about a map, and this is the map that shows the nuclear hotspots in and around the Great Lakes. We don't have very many of them here tonight, but I understand we're going to be getting some for the next meeting in October, which is October 24th, I think. So those of you that want this map. So.
Next Blue Water Sierra.
The next Blue Water Sierra Club meeting, right, which is on Wednesday, October 24th. And then for anybody interested, there is information on the tables that you can see about nuclear waste matters and other environmental concerns. You can sign up to be on an email list that the Blue Water Sierra Club maintains, or you can join either the SC4 Green Team and or the Blue Water Sierra Club if you choose to do that. And the Sierra Club, for those of you that don't know, is a worldwide environmental organization that was founded in the U.S. back in 1892 by the well-known naturalist and conservationist John Muir. And when I was at Earth Day this past spring or so, we ran into somebody that was a dead ringer for John Muir. I hope you see him again because he really looked just like John Muir. Anyway, and some people with like interests, of course, were involved in that. And then our group, which we call Blue Water Sierra Club, is a part of the Southeast Michigan group of the Sierra Club Michigan chapter. All those organizational things are important. We have meetings like this, nature walks and tours, and we share information about exploring, enjoying, and protecting our planet. And like I said, our next meeting, the Blue Water Sierra Club's next meeting will be on Wednesday, October 24th, at our normal meeting place, which is the Atchison Community Resource Center in downtown Port Huron on McMorran Boulevard. And the subject will be announced soon, so stay tuned to your email and you'll know all about that. The meetings always start at 7:30. They're preceded by a short business meeting that begins at 7 o'clock. Everybody is welcome to attend both parts. And I'd just like to say that Kay Cumbo, a tireless leader of the Blue Water Sierra Club, is the person most responsible for tonight's meeting. And Kay is always in the forefront of environmental advocacy, and especially when it concerns nuclear energy and the dangers that contributes to our planet. So please join me in applauding Kay. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers who adjusted their schedules to be with us. They were at a couple of conferences in Marquette, Michigan, and drove here today from St. Ignace, all the way from St. Ignace, on a beautiful fall day.
Colors were wonderful.
There you go. All right. And the trick is to always make this seem, informational and not like somebody's obituary. But Brennain Lloyd, our first speaker, is a community organizer with a group called Northwatch, a regional coalition of environmental groups in northeastern Ontario that was formed in 1988 to address regional issues related to energy, forests, waste management, and water quality. She works primarily as an advocate and organizer around energy, land use, and natural resource concerns, and has served in a number of key advisory positions on mineral and forest policy. Brennain is a frequent guest lecturer on a range of issues related to the public role in environmental decision-making. Some of the current projects that she's involved with include research, public education, advocacy around mineral exploration practices, and engaging with communities who may be affected by the nuclear industry's efforts to site a nuclear waste facility in Northern Ontario, as well as work in a number of environmental reviews for nuclear and mining projects. She also manages select electricity-related cases being reviewed by the Ontario Energy Board. Brennain has worked as a case manager or coordinator for Northwatch interventions in environmental assessments of timber management planning and Ontario hydro demand/supply plans, in Ontario Energy Board rate reviews, and Canadian federal environmental assessments for mining and energy projects, and has coordinated numerous public education projects for Northwatch, including EnviroVan, which is a cool mobile environmental resource center. It's which has completed 4 successful tours of northeastern Ontario, and she's a primary writer and editor of the quarterly publication Northwatch News. And we also are going to hear today from John Jackson. John is a program director for Great Lakes United, with prime responsibility for toxic substances, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, and water levels and flows. He was a board member of Great Lakes United between 1983 and 2007, including 6 years as its president. And his other work has included waste management lecturer, environment and resource studies program, third-year course for Trent University from 1996 to the present, Ontario's Environmental Appeal Board from 1992 to 97, Advisory Committee for Great Lakes Living Systems Audit with the Office of the Auditor General of Canada from 2006 to the present, and 2001 Great Lakes Audit. He's also been a researcher, writer, organizer, status of remedial action plans in Ontario for Ontario Public Advisory Committee between 2005 and 2006, and a researcher, writer, community right to know, Toronto Public Health between 2005 and 2006, and a researcher, writer for Leabops and Paul Muldoon for Evolution of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. And John's been on a number of Canadian national and regional committees, the International Joint Commission, etc., things including he was appointed to be on the negotiation team for the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. And he's had numerous publications on Great Lakes issues and on the public role of policy and decision making. And there will be a question and answer period after the speakers are done. And at this time, let's welcome Brennain Lloyd.
Thank you, Marty, and thank you, Kay, and thank you all. And I want to say that we didn't accommodate you. You accommodated us when we realized that we had the option of traveling this way. There's an international conference on nuclear waste burial in Toronto Monday and Tuesday. And when we realized that followed our Marquette meetings, we looked at the map and said, Kay, Would you like to do anything with us on Sunday? And Kay did. She wanted to do something with us on Sunday. So we're very grateful to the Port Huron community for hosting us and on sort of short notice. So thank you so much. John and I do a lot of traveling. We spend a lot of time in communities who are dealing with different waste and resource issues. We do kitchen meetings to town hall meetings to conferences. And this is just a wonderful group to have out on a Sunday evening, and we're just so pleased to be with you. So we're going to try and do a fairly rapid overview of a whole bunch of very layered issues around the nuclear industry, the nuclear reach, and nuclear waste in the Great Lakes Basin. And there's a couple of sets of proposals we're going to pay particular attention to. But we're going to start and I think Marty's done a very good and detailed job of introducing ourselves, so we'll cut this short. But I work with Northwatch, a group in northeastern Ontario. We're a coalition of social and environmental groups, and we really were born out of public concern around nuclear waste and various proposals to bury nuclear waste. And at that time, in the late 1980s, the maps all showed Northern Ontario as a potential burial site. The maps got a little bigger, as we'll see tonight. So we have a long-standing interest in this that is really driven from very local concerns about the efforts of the industry to transport the waste and bury it. John?
Thank you, Brennain. And as you know, and as Brennain said, I'm John Johnson, and it's really a great pleasure to be here. And I'm lucky in that I do a lot of work along the St. Clair River, and I'm really pleased to see Sharon here tonight, for example, one of the people that I've been working with since about 86, I guess, 1986, in terms of the work for the cleanup of the St. Clair River. Great Lakes United is an organization that deals with a wide range of environmental problems, both in the United States and Canada. We have membership in both countries and work together, realizing that if we want to solve the problems, we can't deal with them just by individual communities, but by getting together and trying to make it so that each community doesn't have to do the same fight over again as though they're starting from fresh and from nothingness, but to actually move things forward in terms of policies and programs so that we don't keep having these threats arising in our communities. We work on a wide range of issues. One of our staff works on invasive species and the Asian carp that I'm sure all of us have been hearing about. I've been involved for the past 5 years on the question of the Upper Lakes levels, Lake Huron levels, and the St. Clair River, and what contribution it may make or may not make to the problems that people are seeing and the changes on Lake Huron. But from day one of the development of our organization, nuclear issues have been critical. We have a nuclear task force, Great Lakes wide, which Kay has been a member of for forever, basically, from its beginning. Because one of the major things around the Great Lakes is a wide range of facilities that are threats from a nuclear perspective. You see from this map that it's updated somewhat from the one that you have in front of you, and a task we have in front of ourselves is to get a new one of these maps out. A huge number of nuclear power facilities in each of the states and in Ontario, and you can see those scattered around the map. The only area that doesn't have nuclear facilities at this point is Lake Superior up at the top up there. But we also have, and beside each of those, of course, nuclear waste. So it's not just the nuclear power plants, but we have nuclear waste beside each of the power plants that you see marked there. In addition, if we go up to the top of Lake Huron, and look up here is an area where they used to do mining up at the north end of Lake Huron, just before you go on into the Sioux and Lake Superior. And of course we have tailings there from the uranium mining that are always a threat in terms of what may be leaking out and into Lake Huron and down through the system. In Ontario, we have, once the mining is done, most mining now is happening in Saskatchewan in terms of getting towards the fuel. We have facilities here, they call them refinement facilities, but changing them into a process to create the nuclear fuel bundles on the Ontario side of Lake Ontario, up in Peterborough, and down in Toronto. And so it's a wide range of types of facilities, all of which are a threat to the Great Lakes, because this integrated system, what leaks into the water, eventually is going to go through the whole system. So what we're wanting to talk about tonight is the threat that is created by radioactive materials and new threats of things we hope not to have to add to this map, which is the question of new centralized proposals for disposal facilities, for massive disposal facilities. And that's what we're going to be focusing on tonight. This is where you step back in, Brennain.
So there's a whole basket. There's a very large basket of different types of nuclear waste. Nuclear waste is generated at every step along what's called the nuclear fuel chain. The industry often calls it the cycle because they like us to think that it'll just loop, endlessly loop. But it's a chain. It starts with the mining now in northern Saskatchewan, the refining on the north shore of Lake Huron, fuel fabrication in Port Hope, fuel bundle production in Toronto and Peterborough, and then the nuclear power plants. Some of that uranium, some of it's diverted off to international markets, of which some will go to nuclear power, some to nuclear weapons production. But in Canada, we are host to the entire nuclear fuel chain. And at every step along that chain, we produce different types of waste. So radioactive waste, nuclear waste, are all of those kinds of waste. And it's mostly low-level waste at the earlier steps in the chain. And then when we get to the reactor stage, to nuclear power production, we start producing low-level waste, intermediate-level waste, and high-level waste. And we're going to be talking about all those three kinds of waste tonight, all in the context of the waste that are generated out of the reactors. So there are other low-level waste, other nuclear waste created earlier, and there's certainly other waste, low-level, medium, and high-level waste created in weapons production, which doesn't happen in Canada. But we're going to concentrate tonight on the waste that are generated at the reactor station. And at the reactor station, so we just want to touch on a couple of basics because we don't know, most people in the public don't actually haven't really thought through the process of what happens in a reactor. How does a nuclear reactor produce power? What goes in and what comes out? So we're going to take just a minute to talk about that. So a reactor, that's just a graphic of a nuclear reactor. A reactor is really at the most basic level, it is a very large, very expensive, and quite dangerous way to boil water. So we use water, so you create steam to turn a turbine to create electricity, the same as you would create heat to create steam to turn a turbine in a coal plant or a wood plant or a natural gas plant, or you would just turn a turbine in a hydroelectric station. So it's a pretty standard way of making electricity. What's really unstandard, that's an extraordinary way to do an ordinary thing. In the reactor, we insert the fuel bundle. So after it's gone through all those steps on the nuclear chain, the fuel bundle comes out of the facilities in Peterborough or Toronto, and it's inserted into the reactor. And it is uranium-235. So it's uranium, it's been refined, but it is only one radioactive isotope. In the reactor is bombarded, that uranium atom is bombarded with neutrons, and that creates a fission process. It splits. You might remember there's a very famous quote by Albert Einstein. He says, with the splitting of the atom, everything changed, except our way of thinking. And thus we drift towards unparalleled catastrophe. It's that splitting of the atom, it kickstarts the fissioning process. That's a nuclear chain reaction. And in that nuclear chain reaction, we have, from one isotope, we create 250 different radioactive isotopes. And those 250 different radioactive isotopes, that is high-level waste. We call it high-level waste, nuclear fuel waste, high-level nuclear fuel waste, highly radioactive nuclear waste. That's nuclear fuel waste. That's what comes out of the reactor. It's not the only waste that comes out of the reactor. We have 3 different kinds. So we have the fuel waste, highly radioactive, 250 different radioactive isotopes, and must be shielded, separated from humans and the environment virtually into perpetuity. Some of the isotopes are so long-lived that you might as well call it forever, ever. The half-life is in the millions of years. We also have intermediate level waste and low level waste. So intermediate level waste is also highly radioactive. Most of the intermediate level waste are the things like resins and filters and so on that have been used to capture the fugitive radionuclides. So if you have the fuel comes out of the reactor core after 18 months, highly radioactive, has to go into a pool for cooling, there will be some release in that pool. The filters and the resins capture those radionuclides. They're used to filter the water. So they are highly radioactive because they have caught all those releases. Highly radioactive, they're called intermediate level waste. And they're called intermediate level waste only because they're not nuclear fuel waste. The language, the regulatory language in Canada says that if it's high level waste, it must be nuclear fuel waste. If it's not the fuel waste, then it's intermediate level waste. So the terms are not that helpful for us in understanding and talking about the challenges that are posed. So they're highly radioactive. They right now are, some of them are at the reactor stations. Some of it, large volumes of the intermediate level waste from Pickering and Darlington have been shipped to the Bruce nuclear generating station on the shore of Lake Huron. Because we have at Bruce something called the Western Waste Management Facility that receives all of the low and intermediate level waste from all of Ontario Reactor. So right now the intermediate level waste is stored for the very short term at each of the reactor stations, then it's shipped off to the Bruce. And it's mostly in, you see there's these are called tiles, and so most of the intermediate level waste is in. So it's sort of like a steel drum inserted into the ground at grade. That's where some of it is in square containers, but it's all stored in temporary, what they would consider to be temporary storage at the reactor station, at Bruce, at the Western Waste Management Facility. Then low-level radioactive waste is very high volume. High volumes of this waste, and industry describes it as being very, very benign. It's the mops and the rags and the suits and the things that have been contaminated, mostly in the cleanup process within the reactor station. It is now shipped to the Western Waste Management Facility at Bruce from all of Ontario's reactors, so that's Darlington and Pickering. And here's the tragic fact: when it arrives at the Western Waste Management Facility, it is mostly incinerated at the facility. So the problem with the wastes are that they are radioactive. The fundamental challenge is these materials are radioactive, and ionizing radiation is extremely harmful to humans, to all living things, plants and animals included. Different types of radiation affect us differently. So there's 3 different main types of radiation. There's alpha, beta, and gamma. But different isotopes also have different targets within the human body. So iodine is particularly attracted to the thyroid. So if you have your child in school near a reactor station, you'll sign a release form saying that in case of a catastrophic accident, an accidental release, the school can give the children an iodine tablet, and the kids take the iodine tablet, and that iodine, the non-radioactive iodine, basically occupies the thyroid, so it rejects the radioactive iodine, because it's very radioactive. If you were to be exposed and your thyroid absorb that iodine, radioactive iodine, it would probably result in a thyroid cancer. There are thousands of children in the Chernobyl area who have had thyroid cancer and have had their thyroids removed. So that's just one example. We've got 250 different radioactive isotopes. They're all attracted to different parts. Plutonium to the lungs, and iodine, cobalt to the ovaries. They're all attracted. We as groups of people are also differently affected. So a man, as a woman, I would be more affected. I am more vulnerable than a man because I have more fatty tissue. So I will absorb and retain and so accumulate that effect. A child is much more vulnerable than an adult because their cells are multiplying very rapidly. An in utero fetus, a baby in utero, is the most vulnerable because their cells are multiplying so rapidly. And the damage is cellular. So if you have a cell go wrong and it keeps multiplying, that damage keeps multiplying. So we're differently vulnerable, we're differently affected. Every exposure does not necessarily mean that there will be a measurable health impact. But it is very well established that there is no safe level of exposure to radiation. Even low levels of radiation have the potential to cause damage. And there was some semblance of a debate about that for many years. There was a minority of scientists who would say, well, and our regulations are certainly give the impression that there is an acceptable level of exposure, that for a member of the public you could be exposed up to 5 millisieverts. But in fact, in 2005 we had a very important report, the BEER-7 report, which was issued by the National Academy of Scientists. Very conservative scientific group, very diverse group of scientists, 7 reports. The 7th one said quite conclusively, there is no acceptable level of exposure. And so there's no threshold that says if you're below that, you're okay. It's called the linear effect. So any level, there is a correlationship between levels of exposure and increased risk of measurable or lethal health effect from that. Not all the health effects are going to be a fatal cancer. The risk is always measured by industry and the regulators in fatal cancers, in cancer death. But not all the health effects are going to be measured that way. It's because it's effects on the immune system. So some of the other effects are things like increased numbers of allergies, other autoimmune disorders. But industry and regulators measure it in cancer death. So for example, the proposal to build up to 4 new reactors at Darlington, they measured that it was a 0.17, I think it was 0.17 infant mortality for the new reactors at Darlington. When we were in a review for the proposal to bury nuclear waste in the Canadian Shield, it was 3 deaths per million was the estimate. So that's the way the proponents and the regulators measure the risk, but there's many impacts and risks and harms that are lower than, that are different than those that are measured. The reason this, part of the way the radiation works, the way radiation continues to have this potential to harm us is because it continues to give off energy. So the industry will talk about the half-life. So each of these 250 different radioactive isotopes have a half-life. And that's the amount of time it takes to reduce its radioactivity by 50%. So plutonium has a half-life of 24,000 years. Tritium has a half-life of, I think, 7 days. So they're very, very big range. But as they go through that process, that decay chain, they don't just poof, they disappear. At year 24,900 years, poof, it's half the radioactivity. It's a decay chain, so it's slowly decayed. If you watch a plant decay, you see it deteriorates, it decays slowly. The radioactive materials do the same thing, and as they decay, they go through a decay chain. So uranium-235 will go to thorium, to protactinium, to actinium, to thorium, different numbers, I won't read all the numbers. So each time it moves from one progeny to the next, it gives off energy. And that energy that it's giving off is radiation, and that's what causes us harm. So we take a couple of minutes at the beginning just to talk about these basic things, because we hear the terms a lot, but they're very meaningful terms that often are said to us in a way that makes us think, that's good news, but in fact it's actually quite bad news. Half-life is not a good news story, because it means that's the mechanism by which that material keeps giving off radiation or giving off that harmful energy. Eventually, it will arrive at a stable state. But that is after all those half-lives have been lived. So, where is now? John, back to you, and I think I've told some of your story.
That's fine. It'll speed us up and get us moving along. So, talking, oops, be careful here, it's delicate. Oh, is it? That's to keep us moving. The nuclear fuel bundles, the high-level nuclear fuel bundles that Brennain spoke about, that are created when we want to take the waste out of the nuclear reactor because they're no longer generating at such a high capacity as before to boil the water as quickly as Brennain was talking about. They're taken out of the power generator by robot. Humans cannot touch them at this point, and are put into swimming pools next to each of the nuclear power plants, similar to this, in order to start some cooling down so that we can then move them to more permanent facilities. And so they stay there 6 to 8 years, and then they are moved, and that's at each of the nuclear power plants. They're then moved to what are called dry cask storage facilities. Again, at each of the nuclear power plants, you'll find casks like this. It's on both the US and Canadian nuclear power plants. You'll find, it's moving again, dry cask storage of this nature. And here, there has been no limit set in terms of how long they can stay there, but this is defined as being a temporary storage situation. And so what the governments in both the United States and Canada and many other countries around the world are now doing is trying to find what they call the permanent solution in order to be able to move out of this, what they call the temporary storage, into something that will be able to survive forever, as Brennain said. The nuclear power plants up at the Bruce, on Lake Huron, which is just upstream from you people here, is where, as Brennain said earlier, many of the low and medium waste from throughout Ontario, all the nuclear power plants, are now taken, a lot of incinerated, others put into the facilities that she described, so I won't go further with that. Were you doing this or was that? Good thing. Okay. So as I said, governments throughout the world, including both Canada and the United States, are looking for what's a permanent solution to this problem. And you have to recognize that the outside parameter of all of this is that in all countries they're saying, this isn't a waste that we only have to worry about for 50 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, even 2,000 years. It's a waste that we have to worry about forever. And that is the sort of facility that they're defining, that they have to find a facility that can separate these wastes from the environment forever. That is, in my mind, a mind-boggling thing, to think that we have the capacity and the ability to do that. So the solution that really all countries have been looking to, although none have yet got into an operating state, is to look at deep geologic disposal, as they call it. And that's to dig down into, and the countries differ in terms of what type of rock they think it needs to be or what type of soil conditions, to dig down between a half a kilometer or a kilometer deep and bury the waste below ground. I can't remember what the next slide looks like. And so to take them down and then put them into these various tunnels that you see, the shafts at the bottom, to backfill them. They're in special canisters still, and there's a lot of debate about what the material needs to be of that canister, because again, we're concerned about separating them from the environment forever, even when they're down here. And therefore in the canisters, and then backfilling to fill them in and basically move away and eventually intend to close off the facility so that it is no longer there in terms of being visible. There's a huge amount of issues around this, and as you can just imagine, trying to hope that you can separate this forever is just really a phenomenal thing to consider. There is a huge number of outstanding technical issues. You have to realize we've been looking for the solution to this problem since we first built nuclear power plants, which is really from the 1950s. And we were told then that, yes, we know we don't know how to deal with the radioactive waste, but our scientists and our engineers will find us solutions to the problems. Trust. Trust that they will find a solution. Let's go ahead and build it. Let's go ahead and generate these wastes that are so incredibly harmful to humans and to wildlife, etc., as Brennain described, on the basis of trusting that somehow we'll figure out how to do it. Here we are, 60 years later, we still haven't got any permanent facilities built. And we're still saying trust. Trust that someone will still find a solution. The sort of problems we're finding that have not been addressed in a scientifically satisfactory waste, and this is just a summary of a few of them, is the canister that you put it in when you bury it. What's the corrosion likelihood of that? How long is it going to last before that canister actually breaks down? The backfill, what do you use when you backfill the thing in order to try to keep it separated when the canister does break down? What is the backfill material that you use? There's no agreement among scientists what will really help keep it permanent when the canister breaks down eventually, which everybody admits it will have to do. Solubility, sorption, and transport of the radionuclides. What happens if this idea that we have that somehow this rock or whatever we put it in will never allow anything to reach them? What if water does get down there? What if there's an earthquake that makes a shift, that suddenly water gets there, and you get this explosion really, emission, quickly to the surface and out far and wide of the radioactive materials? We don't understand bedrock and hydrogeology. We don't really understand what's below the surface. And I'll give you an example. We just had lunch in Midland today, a home of Dow Chemical. And one of the things that happened in Midland, they've had enough problems of their own in terms of chemical contamination and people working for the cleanup. But actually, we in Ontario contributed to those, totally unintentionally, in the Chemical Valley across the river from here. It used to be legal in Canada and Ontario to bury their chemical waste below the ground at the sort of depths that we're talking about here. And each chemical has a fingerprint so that you can tell where it was made and where it came from. So the Dow chemical waste that were put into the deep wells across the river here, we started to find them coming up in Midland. It was like they were going home to Dow headquarters. And I saw it sort of as a little bit appropriate, but still didn't feel good for the people who were living in Midland. As a result of that, it shows that we don't understand the connections below the surface. And others of them were found going under Lake Erie and coming up in Ohio. As a result, Ontario no longer allows disposal of chemicals into deep wells. You can only put saltwater brine into them. Although in most of the United States, it is still legal to have deep wells for these sorts of materials. But it indicates that we do not understand the below the surface. And if we tried to bore enough holes to try to get a better understanding, we would have created our own set of problems by having turned it into a bit of a sieve. And the other thing is a real lack of peer-reviewed studies on these. A few other issues that need to be looked at, those are really the scientific issues, but what if there is some sort of human error made when you're putting them down there, when you do the backfill? You know, we now require that for hazardous waste landfills, we have a double liner. And the installation of those is not easy, not simple, and this is going to be an even more complicated technology. And you often find that the seam in the liners that are required in the hazardous waste landfill wasn't done quite right. And then you start getting leakage. And one of the big factors is real concern about human intrusion. When people 1,000 years from now are around and they see this odd little facility, be they archaeologists by nature or just inquisitive people, start digging into them, just as we dig into the Egyptian tombs or whatever today, how do we warn them to stay away? They probably aren't even speaking the same language anymore. A major part of the study that is being done by all the people looking for disposal facilities is how do you warn people of the future, the distant future, to stay away? No one's figured it out. Just as you see when we send off a spaceship sometimes off to go into deep orbit, hoping that some life out there, intelligent life, will find them, we don't know what kind of messages to put on that they will understand and comprehend. And earthquakes, future glaciation, because we're talking thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years. We cannot predict and we cannot prepare for that situation. Clyde Williams, manager of radioactive substances in the United Kingdom, say, work may or may not indicate that an acceptable safety case can be made. This is someone who is actually working for nuclear industry, trying to really support their cases, and he comes to the conclusion, we can't decide. We can't really make that case clearly. This is where we start, I think.
So internationally, as John's just outlined, internationally there is this interest. There are 13 countries who have looked at geological repositories, burial for high-level waste, and a few other countries who don't have an actual program but are also considering it. But in Canada, in Ontario, we have a proposal now for the burial of low and intermediate level waste as well. And as John said, different countries looking at burial are looking at, it was interesting, in 1988 there was a study came out that sort of said where countries were at, 8 countries were at with their nuclear waste burial schemes at that time. And what I found interesting about that is that each of the countries had had the incredible good luck of finding that they had the best media right there in their own country. So if it was salt, if France concluded it was mud, they had that kind of mud. Holland, it was salt. Canada, it was crystalline rock formations. Switzerland, it was granitic formations. So each country, their research program determined that the kind of rock they had in their country was the best rock, the best geological medium for burying nuclear waste. Interestingly though, none of them looked at limestone. But we have now a proposal to bury low and intermediate level waste in limestone on the shore of Lake Huron. And that is Ontario Power Generation's DGR, Deep Geological Repository. And and this is the project. So locally, people in the Bruce area are referring to DGR1 and DGR2. DGR1 is the Ontario Power Generation proposal for low and intermediate level waste. We'll talk in a few minutes about DGR2. There are many DGR2s, which are proposals to study communities for high-level waste burial. But Ontario Power Generation, so Ontario Power Generation is the waste generator, the electricity producer, also in the longer term. More importantly, I think they'll be known as the waste generator in Ontario. And they operate, the Bruce Nuclear Generating Station is owned by Ontario Power Generation. The reactors are leased to Bruce Power, but all of the waste is still owned by Ontario Power Generation on behalf of the people of Ontario. And they are proposing, it is Ontario Power Generation is proposing to build an underground repository, a burial facility for the low and intermediate level at the Bruce. So this is the graphic for that. And you'll see as we go through, you'll see different drawings, different layouts, different designs, but they're all similar in that they all have shafts going down adits going out and rooms, placement rooms off the side of those tunnels. So shafts, tunnels, rooms. So this is the one at the DGR. This is going to be a big one. 15 hectares on the surface and about twice that size below. So 15 hectares is about, that's about 35 acres. So a pretty large footprint. Because the nuclear waste generating station, Ontario Power's property is very large, they can actually accommodate that kind of a footprint right there on their property. So the low and intermediate level waste goes to the Bruce from Pickering, Darlington, and stays there from the Bruce. The low level waste is largely, mostly incinerated, which is we could spend another week talking just about the incineration, but the low level waste is incinerated, and they call that, they mostly in the documents don't talk about it as incineration, they call it volume reduction. So there is a volume reduction process, otherwise known as incineration. And that will be reduced to about 3,000 cubic meters. And then there will be about the same amount in intermediate level waste, which is that highly radioactive waste we talked about. And it is taken to that's the waste group, that waste categories that will go into the geological repository. So I'll go quickly through this. So there's different radionuclides in the low-level waste. Primary ones of concern are things like cobalt, cesium, tritium. Low-level waste tend to have a lower level of lower becquerels. They're under 10 becquerels, which means they don't give off as much radiation. They also tend to have a shorter half-life, which means it's a more rapid transition to the next isotope. The intermediate level waste we've talked about a little bit already, but the carbon-14, nickel 59 and 63 in irradiated core components. So here's the other thing. We have those resins and filters. A big portion, about 75% of the intermediate level waste is what's called refurbishment waste. So when they rebuild the reactor, the Canadian reactors initially had a design life of 40 years, but lo and behold, they all have to be rebuilt at about 20 years. The Bruce ones have already been rebuilt. So all the controversy, you might remember the huge controversy about the shipping of the steam generators from Bruce to Sweden. That is part of the refurbishment waste. So the refurbishment waste is about 75% of the intermediate level waste. And it has some real nasties in it, some very long-lived radionuclides like iodine 129, thyroid lever, chlorine, and some other nasties. So the dose for the low-level, interlevel waste is higher than for the low-level waste, and ultimately there will be a smaller volume of the intermediate level waste, but a higher level of radioactivity. So they're both of huge concern. So the DGR, what's going to happen in the DGR is they're going to basically move the waste into the underground caverns in the containers that they're currently in. So in the high-level waste, there's a lot of discussion about that engineered container, that extra barrier. For both, they call it a multiple barrier concept. So the multiple barrier concept means you've got the waste itself, then you've got an engineered barrier, which is the container, and then you've got the packing material, the buffer, the bentonite, and then you've got the rock. Well, in the case, that's the standard discussion for burial of nuclear waste. For the low and intermediate level waste at Bruce, that standard discussion is not quite following the same line, because in fact, they don't intend to add an engineered barrier, and they don't intend to pack it. They will seal the shafts, but not the caverns, not the rooms themselves. So there's a lot of additional concerns about the reduced level of treatment, the reduced number of barriers that are being designed into the deep geological repository for low and intermediate level waste. And I think Ontario Power Generation is banking on this because they keep describing it as low and intermediate. It's not really, it's not like it's high-level waste, but it is highly radioactive waste. So this is, I think, one of the fundamental concerns, is that they're designing it as if it was, as if it was a much more benign waste material. There are also some particular concerns with the DGO design in the Bruce. The container degradation, because they're not designing extra engineered barriers, the containers can be expected to degrade, the containers to fail much more quickly. They expect that there will be rockfall within the cavern, and that rockfall will also result in container collapse being much more immediate. There's also a concern, it's saline groundwater. They're at depth, it's actually a salty groundwater. So when the water is expected to move in slowly, but it will move in. And again, that saline groundwater can be expected to speed the decay or the failure of the containers. And the international discussion talks about multiple barriers. What Ontario Power Generation talks about is multiple natural barriers. And they talk about natural barriers as being the different barriers of rock. And that sort of makes you think, oh, well, it's barriers that it's got to go through. But the barriers that they're talking about is the limestone with the shale on top, with the topsoil on top of that. So unless all those radionuclides are very well trained to go straight up, there's no multiple barriers. There's one barrier, and that's the limestone between the caverns and the lake. So as John said, there's all kinds of uncertainties in any of these geological burial schemes. There's all kinds of uncertainties because we don't know how rock behaves, a foot away from where we can examine it. They've done 9 boreholes on the Bruce site. They've drilled 9 holes, and based on 9 holes, they have decided that the rock is going to work really, really well. That limestone is going to be just great for keeping those wastes in. So there's a couple of other social issues related to the Bruce site and the burial scheme for the low and intermediate level waste that I think we need to note. And one is this willing host agreement. So the way Ontario Power Generation tells the story, the municipality of Kincardine approached Ontario Power Generation. Now there is such an intermingling of Ontario Power Generation and the municipalities in the area that it is really from outside that inner circle impossible for any of us to know who approached to, who said what, how this came about. But the way Ontario Power Generation tells the story in all of the documents is that the municipality of Kincardine approached OPG about this problem of low and intermediate level waste. I'm not convinced, but there you go. The outcome of that is that there is a hosting agreement between Ontario Power Generation, the municipality of Kincardine, and other municipalities in the area. And the essence of that hosting agreement is that for an exchange of monies, the municipalities will express support for the deep geological repository, including expressing support for new reactors being built in Ontario. So when we were in a hearing in Oshawa, which is about 4 hours away from Kincardine, we're in Oshawa for a hearing on a proposal to build up to 4 new reactors. The mayor of Kincardine came to speak in support of that proposal. And one of the questions at the mic was, is there any relationship between the hosting agreement between Ontario Power Generation and the municipality of Kincardine and the substance of your remarks today? Well, the chair ruled it out of order, but I think many of us thought it was a very central question. So we have this hosting agreement, and it has created, I think, a real silencing. It's not just the municipality of Kincardine, it's also Brockton, South Bruce, Huron, Kinloss, and I think maybe an area Elderslie, one more. And so they have this agreement, and the money keeps being transferred conditional on their expressing support to Ontario Power Generation's satisfaction, and they're reaching approval milestones. So if they don't get approval, the money stops. The other relationship of note is that the Nuclear Waste Management Management Organization, which John is going to talk about in more detail. The Nuclear Waste Management Organization is the association of all of the nuclear power users, nuclear power utilities in Canada. So it's New Brunswick Power, Hydro-Quebec, and Ontario Power Generation created the Nuclear Waste Management Organization in 2002 in response to direction from the federal government to do so, to become the managers of high-level nuclear fuel waste and to find a permanent solution for high-level waste. In 2008, Nuclear Waste Management Organization, the majority of the board members are from Ontario Power Generation, Nuclear Waste Management Organization. Most board members and most senior staff come from Ontario Power Generation. And in 2009, there was a contract signed and it became open and official that the Nuclear Waste Management Organization was to become the consultant for Ontario Power Generation for the nuclear waste area for the low and intermediate level waste. So you see there's some really complex webs being woven here. And it's very difficult for many people in Ontario, and perhaps for you by the end of this evening, to keep sorted out these different burial schemes and the different waste types and the different proponents and who's doing what. And part of the reason it's difficult to sort them out is because they are so intermingled. So the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, and there are many, is the consultant to Ontario Power Generation, and many of the same people are working, they'll work in the morning on the burial at the Bruce, and they'll work in the afternoon at looking for a burial site in any one of the 21 communities being studied. So it's created some real questions and challenges there, but it really makes the point that the DGR, the burial of the low and intermediate level waste, is absolutely connected to the industry's long-time dream of being able to say they've solved the nuclear waste problem and they've solved it by finding a place to bury it. So we really believe that the DGR is the poster child. The burial of the low and intermediate level waste is the poster child. It's the test run for the high level waste burial. They've got a community that is not only willing but has been accepting funds for a long time on the basis of that willingness. So right now we're in a federal review of the burial scheme for the low and intermediate level waste. It started back in 2008, but where we're at right now is that we are in a federal hearing, and the hearing began, the hearing panel was announced in February. We're in a period right now, it's a public review, but it's a public review of whether Ontario Power Generation provided enough information in all of their documents or not, provided enough information to go on to a hearing. So there's a number of different technical sessions are being held. There's going to be one held October 11th that you can watch online, and we can submit written questions, and the panel will then decide whether or not to forward those questions to Ontario Power Generation. And we expect that by sometime early in 2013, a hearing is going to be announced. The panel will have to give 30 days notice to say that this phase is ending. We'll have to get any last written questions we have in, any last preliminary comments about whether or not the EIS, the environmental impact statement, conforms with the directions they were given for writing the environmental impact statement. So we'll be given 30 days notice, a sort of final go at that. Then there will be 90 days here, 90 days, then a panel will take 30 days to think about that, then 90 days notice on a hearing. We know the panel by a federal regulation is required now to report by the end of next year, by December 2013. They're required to report. So all the documents, and we can put this slide up afterwards if people want to put it on, all the documents are available online. We also have fairly regular conference calls on it, so if any of you are interested in joining us in conference calls about it, that would, you can let Kay know as well. And we've been getting a lot of letters from the US, and it's really helpful. We recently got a letter from Region 5 of the Environmental Protection Agency, I think really probably encouraged to do that from people living in this area. It was a very helpful submission. So we really encourage people to think about that process and that extra tension that is brought into the process by having our American neighbors involve themselves is really very, very important. Really very important to have your involvement. And this is a website we just put up recently to help people just keep track of the process and the issues and so on. So it's brucenuclearwasteburial.ca. And I'm going to hand it on to John for DGRs 2.
I'll try to speed us up a bit here. I notice it's 20 to 8 already. Okay, we'll go through this relatively quickly then. The other type of waste, of course, we have to deal with is the high-level radioactive waste from the nuclear fuel bundles. And in terms of the technology, so I won't go through it again, it's a similar sort of deep geological disposal facility. The concerns around it, again, we did discuss that earlier, so I'm not going to repeat that. And as I said earlier, no one has done this yet, even though all countries seem to be going in the same direction. Nobody has actually done it. We therefore have no experience in terms of whether it works or not, and the scientists are strongly divided in terms of whether it works or not. We're now at the stage in Ontario, in Canada rather, where the decision has been made to take all of the nuclear fuel bundles as they become waste to one centralized location in Canada. And the sites, the 21 communities, they're doing what they call a voluntary siting process. And this sounds democratic and wonderful to people when they hear about it, because the promise that's made in this process is that you can invite us to your community to say you want to explore the issue, and then at some point you will get to have a yes/no decision in terms of whether you want to proceed or not to actually have the facility. And if you say no, we will get up and we will leave. There are a lot of problems with this, and I'll get into these siting issues later. But what we have at the moment, and the period during which municipalities were told they could come forward and express a period of interest, has just finished at the end of September. And there are 21 communities, and they're listed here, and I think you have a map that was being given out that shows them. And you notice that there's a bunch of them that are on the Lake Huron shore, both up the north end and along the shoreline near the existing nuclear power plant, the Bruce plant. So clearly, in terms of people living where you do, the potential here in terms of there actually being the big disposal site for high-level radioactive waste just upstream of you is very real and a very strong potential. And that's why we really believe that people in Port Huron and throughout Michigan need to be really watching this and making their concerns and views known. This is not just a local issue, and therefore it's critical that others be involved in a serious way. You'll notice also there are a bunch of communities that have shown interest on the north shore of Lake Superior. At this point, there are no nuclear facilities and no nuclear hazard potentials on Lake Superior. This is bringing a whole new threat to Lake Superior, which people love describing as the most pristine of the Great Lakes, the place people want to go for vacations, whatever, the place that locals up there worry about climate change in terms of making the climate a bit warmer, that people might want to move up there and may have more of a threat to our environment up there. But there is a really serious threat, and a few out in Saskatchewan. Whichever of these sites, if one of them at all, becomes the site, it means that the waste from all of the nuclear power plants in Canada would be coming to that site. I'm not going to go through the detail of this. This is an example of a display. They're going into these communities. It's a long, multi-step process. It will take about 10 years to make the decision on siting and in these various communities. That doesn't mean that we can wait for 10 years or 8 years or 9 years to get involved in the issue, because you can be sure that the further they get along in the process, the further they get in these steps, the harder it's going to be to get them out of the community, the more that people in the community will start to come to accept them as a natural part of the community. And therefore, it's going to be much more difficult to address it, even in the so-called voluntary siting process. I've seen and experienced a lot of siting processes for hazardous waste facilities, landfills, incinerators being part of them, not on the proponent side, on the side working with the citizens groups, and have seen what a voluntary siting process really means and does to a community. I think we really need to be aware of that. First of all, one looks and says that there's this whole bribery issue that's involved. It's the promises that are made that money will come in. There was the agreement that Brennain referred to for DGR1. The money attached to that is much smaller than the money that would be attached to this facility if it ever came to the community. The community has to make its decision about whether they're going to proceed or not before the environmental assessment impact statement is released. They're supposed to be spending, and you saw this long list, I know you can't read them, but these many steps before they get to the stage of the vote, learning about whether this facility would be okay, whether it's going to be a threat to your community or not. But if they really want you to learn before you do the vote, surely they would have all the technical reports out, all the technical information out for the community to read, the environmental impact statements out for the community to read, so that they can truly be more informed at the stage when they get to make the yes-no decision. And it indicates to me that they know what we said earlier in terms of the limitations of the lack of scientific certainty, and know that those final environmental impact statements won't and cannot have the scientific certainty when they are challenged by other experts in order to be able to hold up. There's to be a hearing on this process, but again, that public hearing happens after the community has said whether they are willing to commit to go ahead or not. And once they have made that statement saying they are willing to go ahead, once they have signed that agreement, once they have had that vote, and a plebiscite or whatever the process may be, that's a legal commitment. You're not supposed to be able to backtrack on that, and the commitment to withdraw no longer stands at that point. The corporation says, you gave us that, you can't change your mind now, we are continuing through the process. So it's a voluntary siting process in a situation where you have to make your final decision of going ahead or not without full information in front of you, without the most important technical information in front of you. And having gone through voluntary siting processes before, I can tell you some of the problems that arise in communities of this so-called learning process before you get to the vote. First of all, I'll go back to the map to give you. Let's look at the communities on the North Shore of Lake Superior, for example. This is a standard situation that arises in a voluntary siting process. These are communities, small communities, single industry communities that have been dependent on a paper mill that is closed down, therefore they're in economic crisis, or a mine that has closed down or they know is becoming close to closing down. They're communities who are feeling an economic crisis. Will our children have to go off to other places in order to get work? So they look at this as an opportunity to help make us economically survive. I remember being in Manitoba when they were down to 2 communities in a voluntary siting process for industrial hazardous waste, and it was just as they were getting ready for the plebiscite, and going to community meetings in the tube, and the conflicts in the community meetings between those who said, we can't put our community at risk like this because of the hazards. We're a farming community. What will this mean for the farms if the landfill leaks? What will this mean for our whole community? With the others who said, we don't want our children to have to go off to Winnipeg or beyond to the big city. We'd like them to be able to stay here. And I remember being at one where the Municipal Development Commissioner said, I have been working for 10 years to try to get an industry to come in. This is the first success I've had. And I'm literally in tears saying, and now you're telling me you don't want it? After I have spent 10 years of my life trying to get something to come here. So you get these huge community conflicts that are created in a voluntary siting process. And that's what really terrifies me about the process. The problem we have in terms of the communities on the Lake Huron, along the coast, the southern part of Lake Huron, just offshore from you, is that these communities become divided not because of the sort of economic desperation situation that we find, for example, in the northern communities, but a situation of saying, we already have a nuclear power plant in our community, and a lot of our people are already working there. Are those people going to vote for against it? It's, they're automatic people who are seen as supporters of it, and the company already drive through communities. There's these little, sponsored by OPG, Ontario Power Generation signs everywhere. When you see a building, a new building built, or have an event, a community event, sponsored by. And so they've already become such a part of the community that people are afraid to think this is just a natural continuation of it. I mean, my view of that, and having gone through siting processes, is that they are under threat of turning themselves into a single industry community, just as those paper mill towns were, just as the mining towns were, of being a community that is totally dependent on the nuclear industry. And what if it goes down? And there's no reason why it won't go down. Lots of problems are seen with nuclear power. What if it goes down? And the threat of having it lessens the diversity of those communities. Agriculture. In the Ontario wanted to site a hazardous waste incinerator and landfill in the Niagara Peninsula, just over here. And the agricultural community was concerned about what would that mean for their crops. And Welsh's Grape Juice, who bought grapes from these people, and also Cadbury's, who bought milk from them, sent letters to us saying, if that facility goes in, we will no longer be able to buy milk from there, even if it isn't showing contamination, because the reputation of the milk will be hurt. The reputation of the grapes will be hurt. So the reputation of agriculture, this is a huge agricultural area, this area in Lake Huron, not in Lake Huron, just onshore of Lake Huron, huge agricultural area. And the other big thing is tourism and retirement. And we're already seeing the tourism people coming out. We're seeing the people who've gone up there as retirees saying, this, we cannot have this. So our real concern about this siting process is that it sounds great on the surface in terms of being this voluntary process, so-called. But what it really does is creates divisions within communities. It forces people to make a final yes-no decision before they have all the technical information. And say you go to a referendum situation to do it. The industry and the government, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, will have all the money in the world to put into the public relations campaign during that election. The citizens who are questioning it, are having bake sales and selling t-shirts. I've been up there seeing it all happening in order to try to raise some money to be able to compete with that. That's not a fair election. People, we of course know, I see the money figures for the current elections in the US, those aren't fair elections either, but anyway, I'm not going to get into politics tonight. I'm moving on. So I think I have basically covered those things, and what I found also in these communities, that even if they do step back and say, no, we're not going to do it, over that 10-year or 5-year or 8-year period, whatever that's gone on, people don't forget. These are all smaller communities, and I was raised in a small community. People don't forget what happened. You don't forget that your neighbor was in support of what you were concerned as a big threat to your community. So even if it doesn't go in, the discord within the community, it still continues into future generations. And this is a site where you can go to nonuclearwaste.ca, which will give you more detail on the high-level radioactive waste disposal of the nuclear power bundles. I think we're ready for Brennain now to update us on the US. It's 5 to 8.
So just very quickly, we have a lot in common between Canada and the United States. You're probably all aware that there was a long effort. There have been a number of, you've been through a couple of rounds. Oh, sorry, I always forget, because I always want to come and be. So there's been a couple of rounds of site searches over the decades in the U.S., and Yucca Mountain was the politically selected site, and it went through lots of years and lots of money, and is now mostly off, but possibly once again on the table. It was the U.S. It was volcanic duff. It was in that 1988 report that volcanic duff was the best media in the U.S. for nuclear waste burial. And these are some of the statements by Alison McFarland, who was a critic, a technical expert critic of Yucca Mountain, and is now the head of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which I think is mostly a good news story. It's not all a good news story, because Alison actually believes that there are geological formations, and in particular, granitic rock formations, the formations of the UP, Wisconsin, Minnesota, are actually good locations for geological repositories. She was an excellent critic of Yucca Mountain, but she is overall a supporter, an endorser of nuclear waste burial. She was a member of the Blue Ribbon Commission, so this is the most recent chapter in U.S. efforts around nuclear waste. The Blue Ribbon Commission was announced, it was a presidential commission, announced when the money was cut off from Yucca Mountain, they announced the Blue Ribbon Commission. Alison McFarland was one of the people on this commission, and they released their report, I think it was last December, who would know. There's a number of points in common with where we're at in Canada that I think you should be concerned about. At core, what the U.S. or the Blue Ribbon Commission has recommended, and all indications are that their recommendations will be accepted. They've recommended that there be a siting process developed to identify a location for a nuclear waste burial site, and they're recommending that it be a consent-based. So that's in Canada, it's a voluntary process. They're recommending a consent-based process. The Nuclear Waste Management Organization, there's been a lot of back and forth. Tom Isaac's senior staff to the Blue Ribbon Commission, is a regular advisor and consultant to the NWMO. NWMO goes down and presents to the Blue Ribbon Commission. They appear to have adopted some of the Canadian approach. They recommend that a new single-purpose organization be created. We had that recommended at the end of a 10-year hearing in Canada, where the previous proposal failed to get an environmental assessment approval, and the hearing panel recommended an independent agency, arm's length from government. We got an industry organization instead. The Blue Ribbon Commission doesn't say it has to be an independent agency, arm's length from government, independent, or industry. They just say a single-purpose organization. Probably something quite similar, possibly something quite similar to the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. the Blue Ribbon Commission also is really, appears very much in favor of a centralized storage site. There's lots of concerns among our colleagues in the U.S. about a centralized storage site becoming a de facto permanent site. All the waste is moved from the reactor stations to a single permanent site. There's concerns both in Canada and the U.S. with this notion of centralizing the waste, and then perhaps potentially facilitating a new generation of nuclear activities, and that would be reprocessing of the waste. Once the waste is consolidated into a centralized location, both Canada and the U.S. currently have policies against reprocessing. Both of Canada and the U.S. have different documents appearing that entertain the possibility of reprocessing. So there's a lot in common, and there's a lot to be concerned with the Blue Ribbon Commission, and I think that it's a very good time for us across the lakes to be really working together on these issues because we have so much in common. In Canada, First Nations, Indigenous peoples, are always a part of the discussion. So these slides are maybe less relevant here, but just we wanted to share with you that First Nations in Canada have expressed across the board in every treaty territory there has been opposition expressed to nuclear waste burial in their territories. It goes from south to north, from east to west. And there have been some very strong statements from each of the treaty organizations' political leaders saying, we won't have it. So in light of the political climate in Canada around respect of Indigenous and treaty rights, it should have caused more of a halt and more of a pause than it has. But we do have a really strong alliance with the
For you specifically is to go back to the map. And regardless of which of these sites, whether it be, here are the ones on the Bruce that are being looked at, the ones at the top of Lake Huron, the ones on Lake Superior, there's a very strong likelihood that transportation of waste will be going there through the lakes. They will be coming from the nuclear power plant in New Brunswick, from the ones in Quebec, the one in Quebec, which has just been slated to be closed down, the ones on Lake Ontario, and all up to whichever those central facilities are. So it makes sense to use a transportation route down through the lakes, up through the St. Clair River, and on up to whatever facilities may be chosen. So it's a really major concern that if we are transporting these things on the lakes, and if there is a spill, if there's an accident, just a couple of months ago I was here and there was a ship that was caught just up in Lake Huron and stuck there for a few days. What if that happened with the nuclear waste, a ship that had high-level nuclear waste fuel bundles on it, and having them going by your door? The other concern that I want to raise for people here is that the promise that is being made to these communities is, and I don't see it as a promise that would give me any assurance, but a promise is that only waste from Canadian nuclear power plants would come to them. That wouldn't make me feel any better, and I'm not sure it makes any one of those communities feel any better. But let's look at the reality. We have, between Canada and the United States, free trade agreements in waste. And therefore, and we've had situations in the past, for example, where the Canadian government has refused to accept PCB waste from the United States, and US companies successfully sued under the North American Free Trade Agreement the Canadian government to force them to reopen the border and to pay the losses that those companies felt that they had. So it's highly unlikely. We talked to a situation that Brennain pointed out where the United States is sort of going back to the drawing board again in terms of looking for a place for its waste. If this is successful, I think there's a very good likelihood that we could start seeing US waste coming to the Great Lakes Basin on the US side, and again, through the waters, because the restrictions in terms of these bridges, in terms of what's allowed to be transported across the bridges through the waters to those facilities, and yet another threat. The final thing, and we won't go through all the tests and the problems with it, but transportation is something that I really think you need to be very concerned about and aware of. That's it. So the question that often comes up, and we'll talk about it in more detail if you wish in question period, discussion period, because we want to get to your discussion very quickly, is, okay, we have those high-level radioactive wastes out there now, we have the nuclear fuel bundles, we're generating more of them every day, what do we do? And I think the first lesson we have to realize is that we should not use a technology and we should not use a substance unless before we approve the technology or the use of the substance that we know how to dispose of it at its end of life. We knew in the 1950s when we started building the power plants and generating these wastes that we did not know what to do with them. That was clearly and openly and freely admitted. All these years later, we still don't know what to do with them. We still do not have agreement from the scientists and the professionals on what to do with them. So that's the first lesson I think we have to learn, not just in terms of this industry, but all future industries. PCBs are another example. We use them widely, all these light fixtures and so on, and then realized we didn't know what to do with them. We couldn't destroy them. So we do have to have a responsibility to figure out what to do now. And we believe that it's much safer to keep the waste in special dry cask storage facilities at the sites where they are generated instead of bringing them all to a central facility, to design those storage facilities much more carefully, and designs that come forward in terms of how to make them more effective, and to give you an indication of the ability of these to stand up. We all know about the tsunami in Japan and the horrible impacts that had in terms of the nuclear power plants. They had and have still been sitting there these storage casks that were actually on the side where the waters were coming in that withstood. They were not broken down. They were not washed out. They withstood. And so we need to focus on that. The other benefit of keeping them in these above-ground storage facilities is that as we, in technologies, find better container systems, we can easily make the changes. We can monitor them to see if it is starting to corrode, if there is starting to be a problem, and we can repair it. Once it's below the surface, we can't fix it. We can't do anything with it. So in our minds, it's much better to keep it in that situation. And of course, the other thing is to say, we can't keep generating more and more of this kind of waste. I know that the Sierra Club here and elsewhere has been working very hard on alternative energy sources and so on. But we really have to realize that it's not socially responsible to continue to generate these kinds of waste. So we'll end it there. That's our contact info. That's for me, jjackson@glue.org, and for Brennain at, there it is, Northwatch at onlink.net. So we'd like to turn it back to you.
Do we have questions? Right here.
Cost efficiency. Nuclear power is what they're all claiming is our savior. And more nations are bringing power plants down. How can these companies find cost efficiency in producing something for power when they have to be constantly repairing these plants and there's no place to remove the disposal? They have to maintain it there on site. So that's not cost efficient. So how do they justify that to their investors?
Well, I can't speak to the U.S. situation, but in Ontario, it's through public subsidies. So we have an Ontario Power Generation, it used to be Ontario Hydro, a Crown Corporation. They built all the reactors, and when they restructured the utility, Ontario Power Generation became what it was called a stranded asset. All the debt was transferred to the people of Ontario. It was a $40 billion debt was transferred to the people of Ontario, and every month we pay that on our electricity bill. And so right now, Ontario is interested in building more reactors. Don't know why, but there you go. They put out in 2008, they put out a request for proposals. They got responses from 4 different possible vendors. The premier called it sticker shock when he looked at the price. $23 billion. They were expecting them to come in at about $8 billion each. They came in at $23 billion, and none of the vendors would agree to accept the cost overruns. So it's 2012, and Ontario is still expecting some vendor to come along and sell them a reactor. Last December, they still had it in the electricity plan. They said they were expecting after Atomic Energy Canada Limited was restructured that they would sell them one at a price they could live with. Well, that of course hasn't happened. So the way it's cost effective is public subsidy. And it's also subsidized because, so now Bruce Power is running the reactors at a profit because Ontario Power Generation, still funded by the people of Ontario, takes all the waste. So the public has all of the liability for the waste, which I think is a similar situation in the U.S. created by the waste contract. So now the people of the U.S. are paying utilities because the feds didn't take the waste away on time.
I have another question. They want to remove this waste by transporting in the waste. How did they get the radioactive material there originally?
Well, when the fuel comes in, it comes in, so uranium is, it doesn't, so there's 3 different kinds of radiation. Gamma is the kind that emits, like in a field. Uranium is an alpha emitter, so it doesn't emit, it has very low gamma fields. So the uranium can actually be trapped with very little shielding. It's only after it goes into the reactor and that fission process happens, when the uranium-235 is bombarded, creates 250 different materials, that's when it becomes really, really, really hot. When that bundle goes in, you could literally hold the uranium fuel bundle in your hand. When that bundle comes out, 20 seconds exposure is lethal. So it's a very different product. The waste coming out of the reactor is a completely different beast than the uranium going in. It's not that there isn't problems with uranium, but it's orders of magnitude. That's how they do it.
Other questions? Yes.
Okay, my concern is, as citizens, what can we do to address this issue with our officials or with someone in our community?
Right now, what the people of Michigan can do is keep doing what you're doing. We're having some great submissions go into the panel, the review panel for the low and intermediate level waste burial. We've had some resolutions passed by county councils here that have been really helpful. There was some great activity here around the steam generators. And I don't know from what pressure points, but from somewhere, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Region 5, wrote a very helpful submission posing some really good questions in this stage of the review of the DGR1. Those are all good things, so doing more of that, but also I think you need to start keeping an eye on your own, what's going to happen as an outcome of the Blue Ribbon Commission. But I think taking a Great Lakes approach. Now, the region I live in is half in the Great Lakes Basin and half in the Arctic watershed. So I always like to say there's some really great lakes elsewhere too. Lac Seul's a great lake, Athabasca's a great lake. But I think for these sites that we're talking about on Huron and Superior, we need to act as a Great Lakes community, and you have a voice as the Great Lakes community. But I should let Great Lakes.
I don't think everyone knows where to write to for those comments.
Well, I think can we go back to that? Why don't you, while I speak, go back to that slide where you said where to do it. The other thing I want to really point out in terms of Great Lakes is that the the governments, the two federal governments just renegotiated the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. An addition in it is to state that there's responsibility for each government to notify the other when there is a proposal that is a potential threat to the Great Lakes. And they list examples. The first example in the list is the transportation of radioactive waste. So it is on the radar of your government. They signed that agreement. They added that agreement to the agreement. It is on their radar, and you need to keep pushing it to them and say, in terms of the water quality agreement, you've made a commitment to not just let Canada run off and do it on its own and make the difference. The other thing that's important is, I talked about this voluntary siting process. Who gets to decide? Who gets to vote? But I think one of the points that you people need to make as you look at that map of your location is to say, it isn't just the people who live in those communities that will be affected by this. They're not the only ones that should get to say yes, no. What about the people who live along the transportation routes by which the radioactive waste will get to that site, whatever site may happen to be chosen if it gets chosen? They should also have the right to say yes, no, because they also will be threatened by the proposal. And so you really need to broaden that definition of who matters in terms of this decision. And letters, getting things in the papers. For example, the fact that people have written letters about the DGR from the United States resulted in a story in the Toronto Star saying US people care about this. Getting more media like that on the Canadian side saying that the US cares will put more and more pressure on the Canadian government as well as the US government to speak out strongly on the issue.
Yeah, my name is Kate Cumbo, and I just wanted to tell people here that if you want to be on my nuclear waste mailing list, if you put a star after your name, I would be glad to add you to that list. And then that's an email list. And the other thing is, Brennain has made this brochure, Deep Trouble, and that has that website right on there. This tells you the websites to go to get all the information on how to make comments right now. And the comments right now are asking questions, asking if Bruce, OPG has given enough information to the review panel to really make a good decision. One of the things that they said when that OPG said right in their documents is that they have consulted with interested parties in the state of Michigan. If you have felt that you were not consulted with, if you felt that you knew nothing about this, you need to contact them. And Marilyn is right, you also need to contact your elected officials, and not just the party of your choice, but contact all of them. Because this, when this county, St. Clair County, fought against a nuclear waste dump, a low-level nuclear waste dump for 7 states, and won, and that was 20 years ago. And it was the Republicans and the Democrats, the politicians that fought it, and it was because the people fought it. And another thing is that I would be willing to do workshops on this if you have groups that you would like me to address. So then, and there was one other thing. President Obama and Prime Minister Harper met 2 years ago and in February and said that they are, in 2 years' time, they would use transportation regs for transport of dangerous goods, of which radioactive waste is part of that. So both countries are in the process of doing that. There also have been resolutions passed by communities around here, and so if anybody would like to take resolutions to their township, to their county, to their city, to their different groups, they exist. We'd be glad to get them in your hands, and we need to make a noise about this right now.
So just keep reminding people that you live downstream. And therefore, if anything goes wrong up in one of those facilities, you are going to be affected by it. You live downstream.
Yes.
Can we say a couple of things as we come from Bruce?
Sure. I guess we want to come up there? Sure, yeah. Sure. You go ahead and talk, please. Want me to?
All right, I'm Sandy McFadden, this is my wife Marty. We come from within 2 miles, 3 miles of the Bruce nuclear site. And we really only we built a retirement home up there.
Can everybody hear this, by the way?
Yeah, we built a retirement home up there.
You gotta get closer.
Get closer, Lou. Move it up.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. We built a retirement home up there. My wife's family has been up there, had a cottage up there since the 1920s. So and a lot of our friends similarly are in 5th generation up there. And it's in Huron, where we come from, is largely a cottage area. But what's happening now are more and more people are spending 6 to 8 months a year up there because they're retiring up there. Now, we consider ourselves outsiders. Just so you know a little bit more about the community, Kincardine, where the site is, has a population of about 12,000. Saugeen Shores, which is just to the north of us, has a population of 12,500. They're very small communities. Kincardine, we're given to understand, has at least 1,500 people that work at that one site. So you just do the math as to how many people are employed. Those towns are essentially a one-industry location now. What happened was when the power plant came in, and one of the members of our group was a student at the time, the people in town were earning $2 an hour working in the local grocery store or what have you. As a student, he was given a job pushing a broom at the construction site at $19 an hour. As a result, as it's evolved, all the other industries, furniture manufacturing, what have you, even the farming has gone downhill. It's become a one-industry area. And what we found, and it concerns us, is that anybody that works in the nuclear industry is extremely defensive, and they take the slightest bit of criticism personal. They can't accept, they have to be 100%. You have to agree with them 100%, but they don't want to talk to you. The people that work there have to sign agreements that they will not criticize the industry. It is really tough to be anti-nuclear in that area. So what's happened? Single industry, highly paid people. Not unusual to get over $100,000 a year to be a maintenance person. I mean, very highly paid. Unique, probably the highest paid area in Canada because of the small population and the fact there's so many high salaries. What we're concerned about, and I think we haven't got very much time. What they're talking about putting there now is low and intermediate level waste. They're very advanced in the process. We're even hearing the stories that they plan to break ground in 2013, so they really expect to fast track this hearing process. You've got it, as it was explained to you, they're all together. The power plants are owned by the government. They're not private companies. They're owned by the government. It's the government that regulates things. You know, it's a done deal already. You know, you can participate in the hearing process, but I just have no confidence at all in how objective it's going to be. We've had cases in the past, and I only know a little bit about it, where the nuclear regulator makes a decision and is fired for her decision because it embarrassed the government. She was right, but she was fired. So, you know, that's the situation. Now, here's the big concern. There are 21 communities that are supposedly interested in taking the high-level waste. I think that process, I think a lot of them are going to pull out as it goes. Therefore, the default location is going to be Bruce. They're already going to have the low and medium. They've done all the so-called studies that needed to be done. And what they'll do is they will take the high-level waste up there. The other thing, too, is the remaining high-level waste is stored inside the Metro Toronto area. If I'm a politician, that to me isn't safe. I want to get it the heck up. Right now, there's 5 million people near it. By, I guess, 2030, there'll be 11 million people. You don't want to expose 11 million people. I'd rather expose 25,000 people. You know, it's that type of decision. It's the right decision. Get it out of there. And that's our big concern. The thing is, once this decision is made by the end of 2013, you've got a very good chance of having Yucca Mountain North right on the Great Lakes. And the site that they're got is within half a mile of the water. Just so you know, we're not talking inland at all. It's within half a mile of the water. The only thing I can say is you've got to get in touch with your local congressmen and senators and what have you, and quickly, really quickly. Canada will listen to the U.S. If the U.S. says no, Canada will stop. But I don't think those of us in Canada, it's beyond us. It really is beyond us. So it's really going to be up to you people to stop it. We can't.
We need your help.
Are alternatives being proposed? I mean, besides saying stop this, obviously, if they're going to be transporting the material away from Toronto, there still needs to be another place. And you recommended this above ground in locust approaches. It would be helpful to be able to say, we favor, you know, this alternative. So what would that be?
Sure, go ahead.
So we've actually followed the lead of some of our American colleagues on this who developed the term hardened on-site storage. We tend to call it extended on-site storage. We've got a couple of problems with the fuel waste the way it is at the stations now. Reactor design is different in Canada than it is in the US, but some of the problems are the same. One of the problems is the fuel stays in the pools for a very long time. So John said the fuel has to stay in the pool for 8 to 10 years. But in fact, 70% of the fresh fuel stays in the pool long after it's fresh. They only move it out into the interim storage in Canada, into the dry storage, when the pools get, start to get too crowded. All kinds of issues around that because it's a high risk for both terrorist target, but also for just human failure. The tsunami in Japan was the initiating event, but it was the failure of the safety systems that created the catastrophe. And that failure of the safety system, what the industry calls defense in depth, the depth was ½ an inch deep. They could not get the power restored at Fukushima Daiichi for days and days, weeks. We don't know that the situation wouldn't be the same at Darlington or Pickering or Fermi or Bruce. Leaving the fuel in the pools, it requires an active system. There has to be electricity, there has to be filtering, the water has to be pumping. It's an active system. When you move the fuel from the pool into dry storage, it's a passive system. They're designed so they don't need an ongoing source of electricity and daily maintenance. So if there's a disaster that cuts off the power, that there's no more, no ability to access the site for whatever reason, it's a passive safety system. Then you add to that all of the security issues. When you have the fuel, right now in Canada, the interim storage, the dry storage, it's in an industrial building. You know, if you go to, Staples or the Breck, I don't know what your big box stores are here, but if you go to a big box store and you look up, that's the kind of structure that the dry storage containers are at the Darlington Nuclear Generating Station, and I assume at Pickering and Bruce as well. It's an industrial grade storage facility. It's not hardened. It's not made more secure. The reactors also are not secure. So some of the work that's been done, and Robert Alvarez, Gordon Thompson, they've done some of the excellent work in the US, and we're now in the process of trying to apply that to the Canadian situation. So we need a hardened on-site storage for an extended period. We need to be looking out, a couple of 100 years. Right now, the fuel, if the nuclear industry, if their dream came true, if their siting process went along with all of their best case timelines, they would be at the earliest moving the fuel from the site 40 years from now, because it's 10 years for siting, 30 years for design, development, and construction, till they begin operating. 40 years from now, we're leaving the fuel in a very unsecure, unstable situation for 40 years. So I think for the reactor communities, Northwatch, our work has always been focused in the north, and suddenly I've got a bit of a wake-up call that our friends in the reactor communities need a bit of help, because they're letting the waste stay there in a very vulnerable state for decades, based on the pipe dream that the waste is going to go away, because industry always said it would go away. So there is an alternative, and it's hardened on-site storage, and we need to be pushing for it now. Kay has a handout at the back. And we need to be pushing for it now, not only because burial is a bad idea, and burial is a bad idea, we could talk for an hour about why the burial is a bad idea, but also we need to be talking about hardened on-site storage because the status quo is not a good idea. And the industry, when you say, leave it on site, the industry likes to say, oh, well, status quo isn't acceptable. We're not talking about the status quo at all. The status quo is not acceptable. The waste is in an unsecured and vulnerable state, and it needs to be dealt with. And if we're going to move it into a state that's secure for 40 or 50 years, let's move it into a state that's secure for 300 years and see what we can really learn about this. All the effort for 50 years has been built on trying to make what they call the safety case for burial. That's where the effort goes. And it's all looking towards the same predetermined conclusion. In Canada, it was 3 men, 3 months, 1977, said let's bury it in the rock of the north. And they spend all their effort trying to prove that case. Since we need to do it differently, and hardened on-site storage gives us the time to do that. Okay.
One thing here that people should understand is that when you talk about transporting this waste, it is very, very dangerous. It's not an easy thing. Whenever they handle the waste, it is very, very dangerous for workers. Workers get exposed. This waste is lethal. If there was a fire with this waste, if there was an explosion with this waste, or an explosion with one of the nuclear power plants, we could have easily very big areas of land and water devastated for forever. So we're not talking, this conversation is obviously much larger than this night. And so, but it's not an easy conversation, and it's not a simple conversation, and I just wanted to point that out. That's all.
I have a question for a couple of King.
Sure.
What can we do to help you? Because you obviously came a long ways.
Well, we're trying to get introduced to this, and we're trying to make contact with people that are way more advanced than we are. Like I said, the things you can do is get in touch with your representatives as soon as possible, say you're alarmed about this. So that, I may have sounded very alarmist, but I did want to mention, one of the documents I read is the summary put together by OPG, and they do cite low and intermediate level waste facilities that have been successful, from what I can see going on the internet. Carlsberg, New Mexico, Finland, and Forsmark, Sweden, low and intermediate. But at those sites, and this is the part that scares me, the Finns are well underway putting a high-level waste facility at the same location. The Swedes have now approved putting a high-level waste facility at the same location. And from what I understand, the politicians in Carlsbad say, well, it works this, why can't we take high-level waste? So once it gets started, it's a slippery slope, and that is within half a mile of Lake Huron. So just so you know that, you've got to stop right away.
I think I pulled myself together here. This is so emotional for me. The reason we need your help is because we're a community on the beach, half a mile or a mile from where this is all going to happen. We have 400 cottages along our bay, and all of us are very concerned about it, but in the town itself, where they have 1,500 of the employees working there, and therefore probably 3,000 votes, they did a survey and came back with 60% of the population agrees that we should go forward with this hosting. And we have talked to most people on our beach, and we found one family that actually got a survey. And they said that it was done in January 2005. None of us are there in January. And they said that they sent out packages to all of the seasonal residents and the people at our beach to give feedback. So that obviously something happened along the way, and it makes you very untrusting. So that's why we're reaching out, because if they're not recommending a vote in our community, any kind of a plebiscite, which is very scary. But even if they were to do a plebiscite, I think we would be bowled over. And so, as John said, this is not just a question of Kincardine making the decision with 3,000 of their 5,000 people working at the plant, and probably many of the other people have their relatives and friends. This is a really big, big issue. It goes beyond our mayor and the council. This goes out to all of the communities that are in Ontario and Canada and across the border. And OPG has specifically said that they will not include you in the assessment because they don't feel it affects you. So they have backed away from including any contact with Michigan or any of the other states because they've decided that it doesn't affect you, you don't have a say. So basically, my husband and I came to say, we really need your help. We are being bullied and bowled over, and if any of you have contacts with anybody who could help us, who could help our other 398 people who live on our community, we would really, really appreciate it, and I would be more than happy to hand our email out to anybody who would be able to keep in touch with us.
I have to cut this off. We've come to the end of our period. I want to thank our speakers today for coming this way and sharing all this with us. And thanks to everybody that came, everybody from the local area, everybody that came a longer distance. Thank you very much. If the speakers are willing to stick around, I'm not sure if they are. If they are willing to, we may be able to entertain a few more questions. But we're going to call this the end of the program. We're grateful for everybody's time. Thank you very much.